Her name was Connie, 15, restless and beautiful, a dangerous combination. She lived for the thrill of being admired. Every glance at a mirror reassured her that she was still as perfect as she thought. But mirrors, Connie would soon learn, don't always tell the truth. The narration continues as Connie stands before her bedroom mirror, tilting her head and smirking at her reflection. Her mother's voice, sharp and nagging, cuts through the air. "Stop gawking at yourself, Connie," her mother snapped from the doorway, arms crossed. "You think you're so pretty." Connie barely reacted, her smirk turning into a mocking laugh. "Maybe I am," she said, brushing past her mother without a second glance. At home, Connie's beauty didn't protect her from the constant criticisms of her family. Her mother's bitterness ran deep, her father barely spoke, and her older sister June was everything Connie didn't want to be: plain, dutiful, and invisible. At the breakfast table, her mother nags Connie about her messy hair and cluttered room. June sits quietly, eating toast, her eyes fixed on her plate. Connie rolls her eyes, muttering under her breath. "Why don't you ever get on June's case?" Connie snapped. "Oh, wait, she's perfect, right? At least she doesn't spend hours staring at herself like a narcissist," her mother shot back. "You'd think you were the only person in the world who mattered." Her father, as always, said nothing, his face buried in the newspaper. Connie hated it here. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. But Connie had an escape. The shopping plaza, with its neon lights and restless crowds, was her sanctuary. Here she wasn't her mother's disappointment or June's shadow. Here she was free. The scene shifts to Connie and her friend, walking through the plaza, their charm bracelets jingling and their laughter light and carefree. Connie's hair catches the light, drawing the eyes of passers-by. A boy leans out of a car window, calling out to her. She ignores him, flipping her hair over her shoulder with a practiced motion. "He's not worth it," her friend whispers, and they both giggle as they walk away. They felt untouchable, but something about the plaza that night was different. There was a hum in the air, a strange tension Connie couldn't quite place. And then she saw him, a boy with shaggy black hair leaning out of a golden jalopy. His grin was wide, too wide, and his eyes glinted with something Connie couldn't name. The boy calls out to her, his voice smooth but unnerving. "Hey, baby, you look like trouble." Connie glances at him, smirks, and turns away. But as she and her friend walk on, she can feel his eyes following her, hear the faint hum of his engine idling behind them. He didn't follow her, not yet, but something about him lingered, like a bad song stuck in her head. The next day, Connie stayed home while her family went to a barbecue. Alone in the house, she basked in the summer sun, letting the heat lull her into a hazy daydream. She sits in the backyard, the sound of cicadas buzzing in the background. The house looms behind her, quiet and still. A faint breeze rustles the trees, and Connie shivers despite the heat. But even in the sunlight, the house felt off, too quiet, too empty. She kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see a face staring back. She was dozing when she heard it. A knock at the door. Slow, deliberate, loud enough to make her heart leap into her throat. Connie freezes, her eyes darting toward the house. The knock comes again, louder this time. She stands, her legs trembling, and steps cautiously toward the front door. "Who is it?" she calls out, her voice barely steady. A voice answers, low and playful. "It's me, Connie. Open up." She didn't recognize the voice, not entirely, but there was something familiar about it, something that made her stomach churn. Panicked, Connie ran to her room and locked the door. She turned to her mirror, hoping for some sense of normalcy. But what she saw made her blood run cold. Her reflection wasn't hers anymore. The boy's face stared back at her, grinning, his hollow eyes boring into hers. "Told you I'd get you," the reflection whispered, its voice distorted and echoing. When her family returned, the house was silent. The backyard chair was empty. Connie was gone. All that remained was the shattered mirror and the faint, haunting echo of her laughter. The heat was relentless that afternoon. The air shimmered like a living thing, and the silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. Connie sought refuge in the little house, where even the stillness inside seemed heavy. She turned on the radio to escape it, its crackling sound filling the oppressive void. Outside, the sun baked the earth, and the faint rustle of dry leaves provided the only hint of movement. Inside the house, Connie felt a strange unease settle in, as if the day itself was holding its breath. She perched on the edge of her bed, barefoot, her toes grazing the cool floor. The radio played a lively program called XYZ, Sunday Jamboree, filling the room with shrieking, fast-paced tunes. Connie sang along, her voice soft, blending with the chaotic energy of the songs. A strange joy began to envelop her, an inexplicable glow rising with every beat. The music seemed to reach into her, tugging at emotions she couldn't name. Her fingers drummed on her knees, and her lips moved in sync with the lyrics, as if she were in a trance. Outside, the world seemed to blur and fade. The sound of the music wrapped around her, making the room feel smaller, more intimate. The heat no longer bothered her. Instead, she felt suspended in a hazy cocoon of sound and light. The sudden crunch of gravel outside broke her trance. Connie's heart quickened. Her parents weren't supposed to be back yet. She darted to the window and peeked out. A gold-painted jalopy shimmered in the sunlight as it rolled to a stop near the house. The horn blared 4 short taps, a signal meant just for her. The sound was sharp, cutting through the stillness like a blade. The car itself looked out of place, as though it had been plucked from a different time. Its gold paint caught the sunlight in a way that felt almost alive, its sheen too perfect, too unreal. Connie's breath caught in her throat as she watched, her fingers clutching the edge of the windowsill. 2 boys were in the car. The driver stepped out, a wiry figure with messy black hair that seemed almost too wild to be real. His grin was broad, unnerving, and he leaned casually against the door. "I ain't late, am I?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. The mirrored sunglasses he wore reflected the world in miniature, making it impossible to read his eyes, or his intent. Connie stood frozen in the doorway, her bare toes curling against the warm wood of the step. The boy's presence felt too big, too loud, as though he didn't belong in the quiet of her home. Her eyes flicked to the passenger seat, where another boy sat, silent and still, holding a transistor radio that crackled with the same music she had been listening to moments before. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice sharp but uncertain. He introduced himself as Arnold Friend. The name was painted in tar black letters on the car, next to a crude drawing of a grinning face wearing sunglasses. He spoke in a fast, practiced way, as if the words were rehearsed, trying to lure her closer. His grin didn't falter even as her frown deepened. "You're cute," he said, his tone syrupy, almost mocking. Connie bristled, crossing her arms over her chest. She glanced at the car again, at the strange symbols and writing scrawled across its surface, and felt a shiver crawl up her spine. Something about him felt wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on it. "These numbers are a secret code," Arnold said, pointing to digits scrawled on the car. 33, 19, 17. Connie stared, her brow furrowing, unsure whether to laugh or feel alarmed. Arnold laughed for her, a sound that seemed forced, breaking the silence unnaturally. He leaned against the car, strangely off balance, his movements slightly wrong. Connie's eyes darted back to the house, to the safety of its walls, but she couldn't seem to move. Arnold's presence held her captive, his voice pulling her into a strange, unwelcome rhythm. "Come for a ride," he coaxed, his voice smooth but insistent. He gestured to the boy in the passenger seat, who was silent, holding a transistor radio. The same music Connie had been listening to floated from it, a surreal connection she couldn't ignore. "You're cute," Arnold added, his voice syrupy, dripping with something darker. "How do you know my name?" Connie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Arnold grinned wider, exposing teeth that seemed too white. "I know everything about you," he said, reciting details about her family, her friends, her plans. His words flowed like a song, mesmerizing but deeply unsettling. There's a moment in life when the ordinary fractures into something other. It was a blistering summer afternoon, and everything seemed just as it should. Birds chirped lazily in the heat. The distant buzz of cicadas layered the air. But for Connie, standing barefoot in her family's house, her world was about to change forever. She first noticed the car before she heard it, gleaming like a mirage at the end of the driveway, the kind of car that didn't belong in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Its gold paint caught the sunlight too sharply, almost blinding, and for a moment, Connie thought it wasn't real. But it was. The driver leaned casually against the car door, his posture deliberate, almost practiced. He wore jeans so tight they looked painted on, scuffed leather boots, and a shirt that clung unnaturally to his frame. He looked up at her house with a smile that didn't belong in daylight. Arnold Friend, he called himself, a name that sounded made up, too perfect, too fake. "I know everybody," he said, his voice smooth and easy, like someone who had rehearsed the line in the mirror 1,000 times. Connie stared at the name scrawled on the car, Arnold Friend, and just above it, on the fender, was a phrase she hadn't heard in years. "Man the flying saucers." The words stuck in her mind, foreign yet familiar, like a memory from a dream she couldn't fully recall. "Do you know me?" Arnold asked, his voice soft yet sharp, like a blade wrapped in silk. His eyes held hers, unblinking, waiting. "I guess not," Connie replied, her voice faltering. But Arnold leaned forward, his grin widening. "Sure you do. You've seen me before. You just don't remember." Connie's stomach tightened. Something about him was wrong. The way he spoke, the way he moved. It was like he was imitating how people acted but didn't truly understand it. His fists tapped together rhythmically, in time with the faint music playing from the radio in his car. "How old are you?" Connie asked suddenly, her voice trembling. Arnold's smile flickered, his face briefly unreadable. 18, he said too quickly. But Connie's gut told her the truth. He wasn't a teenager. He wasn't even close. The lines around his mouth deepened as he grinned again, his teeth too big, too white. His eyes narrowed into slits, framed by lashes that looked like they'd been painted with tar. Something about him seemed constructed, like a mask hiding something far worse. From the passenger seat of the car, another figure emerged from the shadows. Ellie, Arnold's companion, sat in a trance-like state, clutching a small transistor radio to his ear. His skin was pale and smooth, almost unnaturally so, his face devoid of emotion. "He's kinda strange," Connie muttered, her voice breaking the silence. Arnold laughed, a sharp, hollow sound that sent shivers up her spine. "Ellie," Arnold called. "She says you're strange." "You better leave," Connie said faintly, taking a step back. But Arnold didn't budge. His grin grew wider as he stepped forward, one boot landing on the porch step. "You're my date, honey," he whispered. "You just don't know it yet." His voice softened, almost tender, as he described her family, exactly where they were, what they were doing, even what they were wearing. "How do you know that?" Connie gasped. Arnold chuckled. "I know everything about you, sweetheart. You can't hide from me." Arnold leaned closer, his hand brushing the screen door handle. His voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible over the ringing in Connie's ears. "Come out, sweetheart," he said. "You're mine now. No one else is coming back for you." Connie froze. Behind Arnold, the golden car idled, the only sound in a world that had gone deathly silent.